Welcome to Takeshi's Bench, where you can discuss all things philosophical. From this episode onwards, I'd like to talk about Chinese philosophy. Before I begin, I'd like to talk about why I'm starting a series of episodes on Chinese philosophy. I think it's very difficult to come up with unbiased, non-negative image of Chinese philosophy or China in general at this point in the history of contemporary world because of the chaos caused by the coronavirus right now. It's almost difficult for Asian persons to work in the streets of Europe. So I would imagine that the negative connotation of China or Chinese philosophy would increase in the years to come. But I would like to actually mention one thing, that I'm surprised to see how many people are actually ignorant about China or history of China or East Asia in general, especially in Europe or North America or Australia, Polynesia, many places that I've been to in the world. I'm actually shocked with this sort of lack of knowledge about history of East Asia in general. So I think it's very important for us to cultivate the accurate picture of the history of East Asia, especially the time in which we are cultivating very negative image of any parts of it. I think it's important for us to have objective and historically accurate image of what's actually going on, or just to have more information about what's going on in East Asian intellectual traditions. So that's one of the reasons why I'm actually starting an episode on Chinese philosophy from here onwards. Now, when you talk about non-Western philosophy or non-European philosophy, it is important to keep in mind that there are generally two tendencies among scholars or specialists of non-Western philosophy. First is to talk about the difference. So some sinologists and comparative and Chinese philosophy specialists would argue that there are radical differences between European and Chinese or Eastern intellectual traditions, so much so that there are incommensurable differences between two intellectual traditions. Another group of people from the field of philosophy or cultural studies, you started to see some of them arguing the sameness. So instead of talking about the differences between European and Chinese philosophical traditions, and these scholars tend to focus on what is similar between these two intellectual traditions. The problem in both positions is that if two intellectual traditions are so far apart from each other, then it would be impossible for us to have any meaningful dialogues between them. And also, if you just say that Chinese philosophy and a European philosophy is basically identical, and then we lose the importance of actually studying what is non-European intellectual tradition, especially at the Department of Philosophy at the European universities. So I think the truth is usually somewhere in between both difference and sameness. Of course, there are incommensurable differences between Western and non-Western philosophy or European and non-European philosophies, but we should be able to actually make sense of these differences. That is to say, we would have to be able to explain what are the differences. And by the fact that we will be able to actually explain the differences, there are some ways in which we can actually negotiate the conversation between different intellectual traditions. And of course, not everything in Chinese philosophy are unique only to Chinese philosophy. So for instance, you'll be able to actually read some Neo-Confucian texts and be able to actually pick up some of the ideas that we will be able to find, for instance, in German idealism. So there are two trends among the scholars and specialists of Chinese philosophy to emphasize the difference or sameness, but it's important for us to actually see the validity of both positions, or that we should actually balance our position in relation to these two. Anyway, keep that in mind, because some of the things that I would actually introduce in this episode would usually falls in either side of these two trends. Now, as a specialist of comparative and Japanese philosophy, it's impossible for me to talk about intellectual history of Japan without taking into account some of the things in Chinese philosophy. So it's impossible for the specialist of comparative and Japanese philosophy to know nothing about Chinese philosophy. In fact, if you grew up in Japan and study the intellectual history of Japan, you do study to some extent the intellectual history of China. But since I'm not a specialist of Chinese philosophy, I would like to actually limit my presentation to something for beginners. That is to say, I'm not going to systematically explain the history of Chinese philosophy and break it down so that everyone can follow this lecture to understand the Chinese philosophy in most systematic way. But I'm going to actually pretend that I know nothing about Chinese philosophy. So as a solution, I actually contacted my friend who has a PhD in Chinese philosophy, and he he received the PhD in Chinese philosophy in China. So he speaks the perfect Chinese, and he knows the intellectual history of China by reading both Western and Chinese intellectual texts. So I asked him, okay, pretend that I know nothing about Chinese philosophy and recommend me 3 books that I should introduce for beginners. If we want to start studying Chinese philosophy, what should we read to begin with, right? We know nothing about China. We don't know the history of China. We don't know anything about the Chinese intellectual tradition. How should we start? He introduced me these 3 books. First is The Spirit of Chinese People by Gu Hongming. In modern spelling, his name is Gu Hongming. Second book was this one, Chinese Philosophy, Its Spirit and Its Development by T.H. Fang. Third book is this, A Cloud Across the Pacific, Essays on the Clash Between Chinese and Western Political Theories Today by Thomas A. Metzger. In this episode, I would like to actually talk about the first book, the oldest looking book, The Spirit of the Chinese People by Gu Hongming. So first I'd like to talk about who he is, just to give you an image of who this author is, and briefly talk about the content of this book in the following. Gu Hongming, this is how you write his name, was born in 1857. So he lived at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of 20th century, and he looks like this. He was born between a Chinese father who was from Fujian province, southeast of China, and his mother was Portuguese. So he had both Chinese and European personal background. I think when he was 16 years old, he moved to Europe and he studied literature in Scotland. He received a master's degree in literature at the University of Edinburgh in 1877 or 78. And then he further studied civil engineering in Germany. And then also he studied law in Paris, France. So he was very well educated in the European intellectual context. Of course, he was multilingual. It is reported that he spoke Chinese, German, Russian, and French, and also understood Italian, ancient Greek, Latin, Japanese, and Malay. So he was very talented in language. As you can see, he's not a philosopher in the sense that he didn't specialize in the history of philosophy and wrote philosophical text, but he was familiar with the intellectual history of Europe as much as of China. Then he wrote The Spirit of the Chinese People in 1915. Now, this text is really well written. You can see that he's a very talented writer. Here's the preface to the book, The Spirit of the Chinese People. Quote, "The object of this book is an attempt to interpret the spirit and show the value of the Chinese civilization. Now, in order to estimate the value of civilization, it seems to me the question we must finally ask is not what great cities, what magnificent houses, what fine roads it has built and is able to build, what beautiful and comfortable furniture, what clever and useful implements, tools, and instruments it has made and is able to make. No, not even what institutions, what arts and sciences it has invented. The question we must ask in order to estimate the value of a civilization is what type of humanity, what kind of man and woman it has been able to produce. In fact, the men and women, the type of human beings which a civilization produces, it is this which shows the essence, the personality, so to speak, the soul of that civilization." So you can see he's a really good writer. One thing really bothers me about this book is that there's so many misspellings and typos. But it is a great read in the sense that the author refers to many literature including Shakespeare, Goethe, Emerson, as much as he cites from Confucian texts. It's very interesting to see somebody who already did this kind of comparative essays in the beginning of the 20th century. So let's take a look at what he actually says about the spirit of Chinese people. So what he argues in this book is very interesting. First, he talks about the division between Europe and China. Or again, he's going to emphasize the essential differences between European and Chinese intellectual tradition. But we have to put the asterisk on China because this is end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century China. That is to say, he comes from the end of Qing dynasty and the beginning of Republic of China. This is quite different from what we know today as People's Republic of China. This is pre-communist China. Image of Chinese people that Gu Hongming is actually describing is different from what you actually conceive of as Chinese civilization today. So this is old China before the communist China. So that's something that you have to keep in mind when you read this. And also, he only talks about Confucianism. So he doesn't talk about any other aspects of Chinese culture. So the division between Europe and China, he describes it as the differences between Europe is a civilization based on head and Chinese civilization is based on heart. So Europe is very intellectually oriented. You organize the cities and civilization based on discussions and rational arguments. There's something very structured and systematic and logical. But the ways in which the Chinese civilization organizes itself is based on heart and passions. So European civilization tends to be complex and Chinese civilization tends to be simple. And again, by civilization, he means people. European people tended to be more rational, based on their reasoning, right? Chinese people tend to be based on passion and heart and feelings. What is really interesting about the distinction between complex European civilization and simple Chinese civilization is the ways in which he explains this distinction with images. So he says European philosophy or European civilization is like making arguments with a steel pen. So there's kind of fine distinctions and you make categories, right? You have to go through all these procedures to be able to understand sophisticated intellectual arguments. But in Chinese philosophy, it's like a broad brush stroke, like calligraphy. Differences between these civilizations is like trying to make an argument about life and the notion of the self with these really fine pen or using broad stroke that we would use in calligraphy, for instance, in East Asia. So there's kind of aesthetic appreciation of the differences between European and Chinese civilization. Also, what is really valuable, I think, is his explanation of the ways in which we should understand Confucian texts. So he basically said that Confucius is the critic that actually tried to make society and people better place and better human beings. So this is a passage from the book, page 23. He says this: in fact, Confucius tried hard all his life to put society and civilization on the right track, to give it a true basis and thus prevent the destruction of civilization. So what Confucius was trying to do is to use the simple arguments and talking with the people in such a way that we can actually make China or his society a better place to save us from the destruction of civilization. But in the last days of his life, when Confucius saw that he could not prevent the destruction of the Chinese civilization, what did he do? Quote, well, as an architect who sees his house on fire, burning and falling over his head, and is convinced that he cannot possibly save the building, knows that the only thing for him to do is to save the drawings and plans of the building so that it may afterwards be built again. So Confucius, seeing the inevitable destruction of the building of the Chinese civilization, which he could not prevent, thought he would save the drawings and plans, and he accordingly saved the drawings and plans of the Chinese civilization, which are now preserved in the Old Testament of the Chinese Bible, the 5 canonical books known as Wu Qing. 5 canons. That, I say, was a great service which Confucius has done for the Chinese nation. He saved the drawings and plans of their civilization for them. So the Confucian text should not be read in the same way as, so for instance, we would read any European intellectual text. So sometimes we try to read Confucian texts in the context of philosophy class. We try to treat it like, I don't know, maybe ancient Greek texts, or possibly you just read, right, the German idealism. Let's say you read Kant or Hegel, and then we try to read the Chinese philosophical texts in the same way. But that would be problematic because the ways in which these texts are written are different. Gu Hongming is saying that the complex European intellectual tradition would deal and write philosophical problems in very complex, articulate way. But simple Chinese way would be like seeing the blueprints of the whole argument. Right? So the Confucian analect should not be read as the finished product, like a finished house or system of the ideas, but it should be seen as the basic guidelines for building sophisticated arguments. That, I think, is a very good way of looking at Chinese philosophical texts, and this is definitely something that valuable for beginners in Chinese philosophy. Now, European worldview based on the Judeo-Christian tradition starts with this conception of the human existence as something radically evil. Chinese civilization, according to Gu Hongming, starts with this acceptance of human existence as inherently good. He differentiates the religion of Europe as a church religion, and then he talks about Confucianism as a state religion. So you do not have the divine absolute that rules over the heaven and after this life, but you only have the country or the state as the divine entity to which our lives is subject. So a European Judeo-Christian tradition as the church religion, and he describes the Chinese Confucian religion as a state religion. Interestingly, he observes most of the European people are half educated, and Chinese civilization divides fully educated and the masses. This requires quite a bit of explanations, but he argues that the Chinese language, the written language, and the spoken language are different. What European civilization were capable of achieving is to make the language, what we speak, almost the same as the way we write, according to him. And because of this, he says that we created so many people that are half educated, but in China, you still have a clear division between fully educated and the masses. And the Confucian language, according to him, reaches both fully educated and the masses. In this way of living the life of a heart in simplicity and goodness, and believing in your country as the highest entity to which you can actually serve with the basic trust in the goodness of the people, and then division between fully educated and the masses, he says the people in China cultivate this basic sense of selflessness or politeness and loyalty to the country, to the family members. And then you create these heavens on earth. Instead of investing your goodness and moral righteousness for the life afterwards, he argues that the family life can be organized in such a way that they become small scale of heaven, just as much as the state becomes the big heaven. So you have these heavens on earth according to Confucian religion. So the value of a family and state played one of the most important thing in Confucian religion or philosophy according to Hongming. And so he basically divides between European perspective and Chinese perspective and tells you the differences between the two, including some minor sameness. Of course, nothing we read from the previous generation is all simple and glorious, right? There are something that is tinted even in this text, and that is precisely the feminine ideal. So in the process of explaining the politeness and the goodness of Chinese people, he started to describe the ideal picture of being a Chinese woman. And that is quite problematic, I find. So feminine ideal, he makes the same argument of selflessness that we would find in Confucian texts or Buddhist texts, and also a kind of dedication. But the problematic in the context of East Asian philosophy, especially Chinese and Japanese philosophy, is that the term we use to describe a woman with virtue. The term he uses in this text, as well as we use in contemporary Japanese language, is this term lady. This character consists of two characters. Left side of the character is woman, and the right side of the character is broom. So you can see how the description of woman as someone who is holding a broom, right? And then talk about selfless and dedication in the context of this character is very problematic. And then things get worse. He started to talk about the justification of concubinage. And his argument is not to argue that to having a concubine in the context of a Chinese civilization is moral. He's saying it's not immoral. At this point, I just started to think about Aaron Eckhart from the Thank You for Smoking. Have you seen that movie? Right? The argument is almost impassable. First, you talk about feminine ideal with the selflessness and dedication by focusing on this character that has very problematic connotation. And then you start talking about concubinage. It's almost like, okay, dude, you need to stop doing this. Otherwise, people are going to start beating you up with brooms, right? His arguments are very strange in a sense that they are very weak. First, he has this strange praise of Japanese woman. When he describes this politeness or characteristics of gentleness among the Chinese people, he talks about, yes, Japanese people are like Chinese people, polite. But the differences between Japanese and Chinese people is that the Japanese people's politeness is too sophisticated, too complicated, and it's actually unpleasant. And as a Japanese person, I would like to agree with him. The structure of politeness in Japan is so complex that sometimes you can be over polite to actually offend somebody, right? So the Japanese politeness is something that is not simple, and Chinese politeness is superior to Japanese politeness in the previous argument. But suddenly he argues that the Japanese woman is better than Chinese woman in terms of having this selflessness and dedication. Very problematic argument because he shifts the negative view and a positive view of Japanese culture. So that is actually kind of a strange shift in his argument toward Japanese culture in the process of arguing for the justification of concubinage in Chinese culture. And also, he uses this after the fact and a utilitarian argument, which is not always a great argument. After the fact utilitarian argument is like, look, we did this and it worked, therefore it was the right method. Well, his argument is that imagine the European gentleman having a concubines. If the European man is going to do the same thing as the Chinese man, he won't be able to actually keep his house at peace. However, the Chinese gentleman will be able to actually keep the house at peace while having concubines, right? So this is very weak after the fact utilitarian argument in the sense that, look, Chinese men can do it and European men cannot do it, therefore Chinese are doing right. That's not really a good argument. Also, finally, the basis in which he argues that this is the strongest argument that he provides for the justification of concubinage is the consent and loyalty. That is to say, Chinese women, agreed to do this to demonstrate their loyalty to their husbands or male partners. Because they agreed to do it, therefore it should be justified. Now, this is quite problematic. What if the society is structured in such way that the weak, meek, subjugated have no choice but to consent to the argument that is actually not beneficial for them? For instance, you can easily argue that the one person agreed to give up his human rights, therefore we can do whatever we want with him. That argument is actually not good because the certain prescriptive elements is not up to consent or loyalty. So there are some elements in his arguments for the concubinage is very, the idea itself is problematic, and the ways in which he argues for the idea is very problematic too. So I think this part of the book should be read carefully, and also we have to recognize its limited use. That is to say, we won't be able to use this part of the book for any fruitful argument unless we use it to understand the problems that we would see in the current society. So if we are going to talk about gender inequality in contemporary China or East Asia general, it would be a very great place to look at. Like, okay, this is how male intellectuals in early 20th century are making this argument to keep this inequality between man and woman. But I don't think we will be able to actually read this as a source of defending the idea of concubinage. That would be ridiculous. But that's something to keep in mind when you actually read this text, because some parts are not pleasant to read, but then you have to actually put in the historical context where the concubinage was actually legal. I think it was legal up until mid-50s. So you have to keep that in mind. So you have to see how Gu Hongming's argument is a very aesthetic argument. It's not precise intellectual argument that you would actually see in European philosophical texts, but he gives you this feel for how the Chinese philosophy should be approached. So we would have to entertain the possibility of reading aesthetically, or reading with the heart rather than just with the mind. And we would have to see, let's say, Confucian text as something much more like blueprints or drawings of something more sophisticated rather than sophisticated text that gives us a system of thinking. So these are some positive elements that we will be able to actually get from reading this text. There are some parts that we have to actually put asterisk and keep in mind that this is the text that written in 1910s. That's my analysis of The Spirit of Chinese People by Gu Hongming. I'll be interested to hear what you actually think about this book. Feel free to leave your comments. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to actually respond to some of these questions. And in the next episode, I would like to talk about the T.H. Fang's Chinese philosophy book, the second book that I talked about in the beginning of this episode. Okay, if you made it this far, you should definitely like this video. And also, if you're interested in philosophy, please subscribe to this channel, Takeshi's Bench. If you have any questions about philosophy or comments, arguments, and ideas on all things philosophical, please send them to us through comments. We will try to pick up some of them for the future episodes. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.